second year at the Bureau of Land Management before I left for the private sector, and he stayed on doing whatever it is career men do when they stop expecting promotions. The message was short. A relay outpost in the high desert had gone silent on the administrative side, but was still transmitting on its operational channel. The contractor responsible had filed for bankruptcy. The federal lease was in a gray area. Someone needed to drive out, confirm the structure was intact, log the equipment, and decide whether the transmissions were automated or whether a person was still inside. The pay was generous in the way that suggests no one wants to ask too many questions about who was doing the work. I took it because I needed the money, and because I had spent the better part of a year inside a rented house in Reno, trying not to think about my brother. He had died the previous March in a way that the coroner described as undetermined, and that the rest of the family treated as a closed subject. I had not been close to him in the years before, but I had been close to him when we were children, and that earlier closeness had begun to feel like the only real thing I owned. Driving out into empty country seemed, at the time, like a reasonable substitute for grief. I packed a duffel, a field notebook, a department-issued laptop that still worked if you were patient with it, and a thermos that had belonged to my father. I left Reno on a Tuesday morning with the directions printed on a sheet of paper, because Halloran had warned me the cell signal would die about 40 miles in. The outpost sat on a flat shelf of pale rock in the eastern part of the state, in a stretch of land that does not appear on most road atlases, because there is nothing in it worth labeling. The drive took most of the day. The road narrowed from 2 lanes to 1, then from asphalt to gravel, then to a pair of wheel ruts that kept disappearing under drifts of sand. I passed 3 vehicles in the last 100 miles, all of them moving the other direction. The sky out there has a particular quality I had forgotten about, a hard pale blue that does not soften at the edges, and the silence when I stopped to check my map was the kind of silence that makes you aware of the sound of your own jaw moving. The structure itself was smaller than I had expected. A single-story building of poured concrete, painted the color of old bone, with a steel door and no windows on the side facing the road. Behind it, a transmission tower rose maybe 60 feet, guy-wired to anchors set into the rock. A second smaller building, a generator shed, sat about 30 yards off. There were no vehicles. There was no sign of recent foot traffic, though the wind out there erases tracks within hours. The only thing that suggested the place was occupied was a low mechanical hum coming from inside the main building, the sound of something running on its own schedule. I had been given a key code. The door opened on the second try. Inside, the air was warmer than outside by about 10 degrees and smelled faintly of ozone and old coffee. The main room held a console of broadcast equipment that looked roughly 15 years out of date. 2 metal desks pushed against opposite walls, a cot with a folded wool blanket, and a small kitchenette with a hot plate and a sink. A door at the back led to a bathroom and a storage closet. Everything was tidy in the way that a place gets tidy when one person lives alone for a long time and develops habits. There was a coffee mug on the desk with a residue ring at the bottom, dried completely. A paperback novel lay open on the cot, spine creased, a receipt being used as a bookmark. The receipt was from a gas station in a town I had passed through, dated 6 weeks earlier. The console was running. A red transmission light glowed steady on the leftmost panel. Headphones rested on the desk beside the microphone, and when I picked them up and put them on, I could hear, faintly, a man's voice. He was reading what sounded like a weather report. Wind speeds, pressure readings, temperature ranges. The kind of dry numerical information that nobody listens to unless they have a specific reason. The voice was calm and slightly nasal, with a trace of a regional accent I could not place. When the report ended, there was a pause of about 4 seconds, and then the same voice began reading a list of call signs and acknowledgments. None of the signs corresponded to anything I recognized. I logged the time and made a note in my field book. My instructions had been clear that I was not to interrupt any active broadcast, only to observe and document. I sat down at the second desk and watched the equipment for the better part of an hour. The voice continued. Reports, acknowledgments, the occasional reading of what sounded like coordinates. There was no music, no station identification, no commercial breaks. After a while, I realized I had been listening with the kind of attention you give to a conversation in another room, trying to determine whether you were being talked about. I took the headphones off and went outside to walk the perimeter before the light failed. The generator shed was locked, but through a gap in the door I could see that the unit inside was running on diesel and that the fuel tank gauge read just under half. Whoever had set this up had filled it recently, or had set it to draw from a buried reserve. I made a note. Behind the shed I found a small graveled area where someone had parked a vehicle for a long time, judging by the oil staining. There were no tire tracks leading away. Whoever had left, if they had left, had not driven out. I slept that night on a bedroll on the floor rather than use the cot, which felt like a thing that belonged to someone else. The transmission continued through the night. I could hear it faintly even with the headphones disconnected, leaking from a small monitor speaker mounted above the console. I had turned the volume down as far as it would go without muting it, because Halloran had been specific about not interrupting the broadcast, and because some part of me did not want the room to be silent. In the morning I made coffee on the hot plate and began going through the logbooks. There were 3 of them, kept in a drawer beneath the console, handwritten in a small, neat script. The most recent entries were dated about 7 weeks earlier. The writer, who signed his entries only with the initial M, recorded broadcast times, equipment readings, and occasional weather observations. The entries were professional and uninflected for most of their length. About 2 weeks before they stopped, the tone shifted, not dramatically. M began noting things that were not strictly operational. He recorded that he had heard what sounded like a second voice on the outgoing channel during a routine transmission, and that when he reviewed the recording, the voice was not present. He wrote that he had begun keeping the headphones on even when not transmitting, because he wanted to know whether the sound was in the equipment or in the room. He wrote, in an entry dated 4 days before the last one, that he had started recognizing the cadence of the second voice, and that it sounded like his own voice from years ago, before his throat surgery. The last entry was 3 lines long. It read, confirmed second channel is bleeding through. Source unknown. We'll continue logging until relief arrives. There was no relief scheduled. I checked the file Halloran had sent me. The outpost had been operating on a single occupancy rotation for over 2 years, and the contractor had not assigned a replacement to M because the contractor had been dissolving in slow motion the entire time. M had been alone out here, broadcasting weather reports to no one for longer than anyone had bothered to track. I spent the second day cataloging equipment and trying to determine where the broadcast was actually going. The console was wired to the tower, which was wired to a directional antenna pointed roughly northeast. Northeast of the outpost there is, as far as I could determine from the maps, nothing at all for at least 300 miles. No towns, no other relays, no listed receivers. The signal was being sent into empty country. The carrier frequency was logged in EMS notebook as a 6-digit number that did not match any commercial or federal band I could identify, though my knowledge of broadcast allocations is admittedly out of date. That afternoon I put the headphones on again and listened for a longer stretch. The voice continued its rotation of reports and acknowledgments. I began to notice patterns. The same set of coordinates was read approximately every 40 minutes. The same 3 call signs were acknowledged in the same order. The weather data, when I checked it pressure readings corresponded to no front I could identify. The voice was reading whether that was not happening. I sat with that for a while. The most reasonable explanation was that the broadcast was a recording on a long loop, and that M had set it up before something happened to him. But the recordings I found in the equipment cabinet, when I cataloged them, were all dated and labeled, and none of them contained the content I was hearing. The active broadcast was not coming from any tape or drive I could locate. It was coming from the microphone input, which meant that as far as the equipment was concerned, someone was speaking into the microphone in real time. The microphone was sitting on the desk in front of me. No one was speaking into it. I disconnected the headphones and listened through the monitor speaker instead. The voice continued, calm and slightly nasal, reading a pressure value of 29.71 inches and falling. I picked up the microphone and turned it over in my hands. It was a standard broadcast condenser, the kind that needs phantom power to operate. The phantom power indicator on the console was lit. The signal meter on the input channel was moving in time with the voice I was hearing. Whatever was producing the sound was electrically present in the room. I set the microphone down. I made a note in my field book. I went outside and walked around the building twice, slowly, looking for anything I might have missed. A second antenna, a hidden cable, a relay device. Anything that would explain how a signal could appear at the input of a microphone that no one was using. I found nothing. The wind had picked up and the light was beginning to slant. I went back inside. That night I slept badly. The voice continued through the speaker, and although I had turned the volume down again, I found myself waking every hour or so to listen, the way you wake to check on a sick animal. At some point in the early morning, I dreamed about my brother. In the dream, he was sitting at the second desk, the one I had been using, and he was wearing the headphones and writing something in my field book. He looked up at me and said something I could not hear, and when I asked him to repeat it, he smiled in a way that was not quite his smile, and I woke up. The field book was on the desk where I had left it. I checked the most recent page. My handwriting, my notes, nothing added. But when I flipped back through earlier pages, I found, on a page I had used the previous afternoon, a line written below my last entry in a hand that was not mine. The line read, "Pressure falling, will advise." It was written in the same small, neat script as EM's logbook entries. I sat with the book in my hands for a long time. The reasonable part of my mind began constructing reasonable explanations. I had written the line myself in a state of fatigue and forgotten. M had been in the building before I arrived and had used my book somehow, though I had brought it with me from Reno. The handwriting only resembled M's because I had been staring at his logbooks for 2 days and was projecting the similarity. None of these explanations were satisfying, but I wrote them down anyway, in my own hand, on the next page, because writing them down felt like an act of self-defense. I tried to call Halloran on the satellite phone I had been issued. The phone connected to the network, but the call would not complete. I tried twice more over the course of the morning with the same result. The phone showed full signal. The call simply would not go through. By the third day, I had begun to develop habits that were not mine. I noticed this slowly. I had started checking the pressure gauge on the exterior wall every 40 minutes, in time with the broadcast. I had started leaving the headphones on the desk in a particular orientation, with the cable looped clockwise, which was how M had left them in the photograph clipped inside the front cover of his most recent logbook. I had begun making coffee in the same mug with the residue ring, rinsing it but not washing it, because washing it felt like an intrusion. When I caught myself doing these things, I stopped, but I could not always remember starting. The voice on the broadcast had also changed, or I had begun to hear it differently. The cadence was the same, the content was the same, but underneath the calm nasal delivery there was now, faintly, a second register, a breath pattern that did not match the speech, as though someone were speaking the words and someone the second register returned. It was only present in real time. It could not be captured. That afternoon I found the photograph. It was in the back of the third logbook, tucked into a sleeve I had not noticed before. A small color print, slightly faded, of two men standing in front of the outpost. The building was newer in the photograph, the paint less weathered, but it was unmistakably the same structure. One of the men I assumed was M, based on his position and the way he was holding a clipboard. The other man was turned slightly away from the camera, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. I looked at the photograph for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. The hat was a brown felt hat with a darker band, and the way the man was standing, with his weight on his left leg and his right hand in his jacket pocket, was a way I had seen 1,000 times. It was my brother. The photograph was dated, in pencil on the back, 11 years earlier. My brother had never, to my knowledge, been to this part of the state. He had worked in insurance. He had lived in Sacramento for most of his adult life. There was no reason for him to have stood in front of this building 11 years ago, and there was no reason for his image to be in the logbook of a man I had never met. I sat at the desk with the photograph in my hand and listened to the voice on the broadcast. Read a set of coordinates. I wrote the coordinates down. I cross-referenced them on the map. They corresponded to a point about 2 miles northeast of the outpost, in the empty country toward which the antenna was pointed. I marked the point on the map and stared at it for a while, and then I put on my jacket and took a flashlight and a bottle of water and started walking. The walk took most of the afternoon. The terrain was flat but broken, full of low ridges and shallow washes that did not show on the map. The wind was steady and cold. I kept the antenna behind me and walked toward the marked point, checking my compass every few minutes. About 1.5 miles out, I began to feel that I was being followed, in the particular way you feel it when you are alone in open country, and there is nothing behind you but your own awareness. I did not turn around. I kept walking. The point on the map, when I reached it, was a shallow depression in the rock about 20 feet across. In the center of the depression was a metal hatch, set flush with the ground, painted the same bone color as the outpost. There was no marker, no signage, no equipment housing, just the hatch. It had a recessed handle and a keyhole. The key from the outpost did not fit. I knelt beside it and put my ear to the metal and listened for a long time. I could hear nothing, but when I held my hand flat against the hatch, I could feel, faintly, the same low mechanical hum that filled the outpost. Whatever was running in that building was running here too, underground, in a structure that did not appear in any document I had been given. I walked back to the outpost as the light was failing. The voice on the broadcast was reading acknowledgments when I came through the door. I sat down at the desk and put the headphones on and listened, and after the third call sign, the voice paused for longer than it usually did, and then said, in the same calm nasal delivery, my name, my full name, including the middle name that I do not use and that does not appear on any document I had brought with me. I took the headphones off. I sat in the chair without moving for what was probably several minutes. The voice continued through the monitor speaker, returning to its rotation of weather and coordinates, as though nothing had happened. I picked up the field book and wrote down what I had heard, and the time, and the fact that I had heard it. My hand was steady. I noticed this with something like detachment. I packed my duffel that night. I told myself I would leave at first light. I told myself that I had completed enough of the assignment to justify the fee, that I would write my report from Reno, that Halloran could send someone else if he wanted further documentation. I lay on the bedroll with my jacket on and my boots beside me, and I did not sleep. At some point in the early morning, the broadcast stopped. The change was not dramatic. The voice finished a sentence about wind direction and then did not begin a new one. The transmission sounds a person makes when they are sitting still and waiting. I listened for what I think was about 10 minutes. Then the voice returned and read a pressure value and continued as though nothing had paused. I left at dawn. I did not take the logbooks. I did not take the photograph. I locked the door behind me with the key code, and I drove out the way I had come, slowly, because the wheel ruts were harder to follow in the early light. I reached the gravel road by mid-morning and the asphalt by early afternoon, and I made it to a motel outside of Winnemucca by nightfall and slept for 14 hours. I wrote my report from Reno. I described the structure, the equipment, the logbooks, the broadcast. I noted that the previous occupant appeared to have abandoned the post approximately 7 weeks before my arrival, and that the broadcast was continuing through means I could not determine. I recommended that the outpost be physically secured, and the transmission terminated at the source. I did not mention the hatch in the rock. I did not mention the photograph. I did not mention what the voice had said. Halloran called me 4 days later. He thanked me for the report. He said the matter was being handled. He said the contractor's records had been more disordered than expected, and that there was some confusion about which assets were federal and which were private, and that the outpost would likely be left in its current state until the legal questions were resolved. I asked him how long that might take. He said he did not know. I asked him whether anyone had been sent to retrieve the body. He paused for a moment and then said that no body had been recovered, and that the previous occupant was being treated as a missing person. He said this in the tone of a man who has said the same thing about other people in other places and does not expect to be asked follow-up questions. I have been back in Reno for almost a year now. I have taken other work. I do not listen to the radio in my car anymore, which is a small thing, but it is a thing I have noticed about myself. I do not keep my coffee mug with a residue ring at the bottom. I wash it after every use, sometimes twice. 3 months ago, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single cassette tape, unlabeled, in a plain plastic case. I do not own a cassette player. I have not bought one. The tape is in a drawer in my kitchen, beneath a stack of utility bills, and I have not thrown it away, and I have not listened to it, and I do not entirely understand why I am unable to do either of those things. Last week, I was going through old family photographs, the ones my mother left me when she moved into the assisted living facility. In a box of pictures from the late 90s, from a family trip I do not remember taking, I found a photograph of my brother standing in front of a building I recognized. He was younger in the picture than he had been when he died. He was wearing a brown felt hat with a darker band. He was holding a clipboard. He was smiling at the camera in a way that was almost his smile. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, in a small neat script that was not my mother's handwriting and was not my brother's, someone had written, "Pressure falling will advise." I have not told anyone about the photograph. I keep it in the same drawer as the cassette tape. Some nights, when the apartment is quiet and I am sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and a cup of coffee going cold beside me, I think about the hatch in the rock and the antenna pointed at nothing, and the voice that read my full name, and I think about the fact that the broadcast was still running when I drove away, and that as far as I know it is running now, into empty country, to a receiver that does not exist on any map, and that somewhere in the rotation, between the weather and the coordinates and the acknowledgements, my name is still being said, in a calm nasal voice. At intervals I have stopped trying to calculate. I do not know what is listening. I only know that something is, and that it knows where I live, and that it is patient in a way that nothing alive has any reason to be.